Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frate Eleftheria, and tonight I want to share with you another aspect of my spiritual journey that I haven't really spoken about in a lot of detail on this channel. I've spoken a lot about my time in the AA and the sorts of things that I learnt and practiced when I did that, but there's another important chapter in my spiritual development which involved me exploring the teachings of another esoteric group, a group which has gone by many different names: the Gnostic Society, the Gnostic Association. They refer to themselves as simply Gnosis these days. And this is a group that I spent some years in for a time. And there are some things that I learnt that were of great value from my time in that school. And talking about it will allow me to illuminate another part of the esoteric path that will allow us to go deeper into our understanding of the Western esoteric tradition. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. So first of all, how did I get involved with Gnosis? In mid-2017 or thereabouts, my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, so I'll just refer to her as my wife from now on, she was in a New Age shop and she happened upon a poster which was offering classes in something called Gnosis. And there must have been a flyer as well that was associated with that was nearby. Anyway, she brought this flyer home with her, and it had Gnosis on it in big letters, and it had an image of the Archangel Michael, that sort of classic painting of the Archangel Michael lancing the dragon. And this image really spoke to her because she was working with Gabriel at the time, and it was like a striking image of an angel. And it was an image that really spoke to me as well, because Saint Michael is an archangel that's very close to my own heart. He is my confirmation saint. And so we were both very drawn by this image for different reasons. And we decided to start going to these classes together. And so we received lectures on a number of topics. And in the beginning, this was more an academic interest that we had in Gnosis and what this particular esoteric group was teaching, particularly since I was in the AA at the time, so that was very much the focus of my practice and my beliefs. But I had a curiosity about this other thing, and I recognized that some of the topics in the introductory course could add some depth to my own studies. And so we were part of this Gnostic study group. There's any number of Gnostic groups in a particular city. It'll usually be headed by a missionary couple, a man and a woman. The teachers are referred to as missionaries. So this Gnosis, this Gnosticism, it's not to be confused with ancient Gnosticism, which doesn't exist anymore and cannot be revived in its previous form. This is a form of neo-Gnosticism, and particularly more influenced by the later Western esoteric tradition than Gnosticism itself, but labels itself as a Gnostic school. Gnosis was founded by a guy called Victor Emmanuel Gomez, who took on what you could say was his magical name, I suppose, of Samael Aun-Weor. He was born in Colombia, then learned a bunch of stuff about esoteric spirituality, started his own group, traveled around Latin America teaching people, eventually wound up in Mexico and published a bunch of books. So his background is that he was involved in the Theosophical Society from when he was quite young, like a teenager, and then he was later initiated into an esoteric order known as the Fraternitas Rosicruciana Antiqua, which is, as the name suggests, a Rosicrucian order. He's also said to have spent some time in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Maria, hanging out with the indigenous peoples there and picking up more stuff from them, particularly herbalism. So he's involved in these various different spiritual groups, in these various different spiritual circles, and is accumulating knowledge in the process, and then eventually started his own thing, which came to be known as Gnosis. It's got branches all over the world now, because it is a very missionizing esoteric school compared to some of the others. But it's definitely focused more in Latin America. So as you've probably gathered from the different groups that Samael Aun Weor himself was involved in, Gnosis is very influenced by Rosicrucianism, it's very influenced by Theosophy, and it's also highly influenced by the teachings of a mystic known as G.I. Gurdjieff, who you might have heard of. He's the founder of the Fourth Way, hugely important in this context. And there's a lot of devotion to the Pistis Sophia as a religious text. And so my wife and I kept going to these classes, and we became more and more committed to Gnosis and going through Gnosis together. Not only going to the classes, but going to the various retreats, doing certain rituals together in the context of that esoteric school. And so we became quite committed to Gnosis. It was definitely something that took time for me, because I had my own preconceived ideas of where I should be going on the spiritual path, which were much more focused on Thelema. And there were things that were different about Gnosis compared to the Thelemic orders like the OTO and the AA. Just very different set of spiritual convictions at their core, because of course Gnosis, as you might have gathered, is very much based in esoteric Christianity. Whereas Thelema is, some people would say that it's just a completely different form of spiritual philosophy, but if we're being completely honest with ourselves, Aleister Crowley created Thelema in opposition to Christianity. So you can see how there would be a tension there, and how there would be things that challenged my preconceived ideas that I was learning, but I was prepared to be challenged. And I was able to appreciate that much of what was taught in Gnosis seemed to draw from the very same well of Western esotericism as the very orders that I was involved in, the OTO and the AA. We learnt a lot in Gnosis. We learnt heaps. And I'm not going to go into all the teachings that we were given, because, well, number one, they were so encyclopedic that it would be impossible to summarize in a short video such as this. But also, there are some teachings I shouldn't talk about publicly because they're meant to be kept secret, and also just because I'm not a missionary, so it's not really my place to do that. But I can talk about my own personal experiences, what benefited me and what I learned in particular aspects of that system. So there were a few teachings in particular that had a lasting impact on my own spiritual development. And the first of these set of teachings were those that Gnosis inherited from Gurdjieff, the teachings on the work on oneself. So basically, Gurdjieff taught this idea of the pluralized I, or the pluralized ego, that, you know, we think about the ego as the false self, to use the language that is often borrowed from Western translations of Buddhist and Hindu texts. We have the ego, which is the false illusory self. And Gurdjieff had this innovation that we don't just have one ego, which is like a stable, unified personality. We actually have a plurality of egos. Every one of our, what in Christian terms would be called sins or vices, has like its own personality that forms around it. And all these different personalities within us are vying and competing to be heard and to have their needs met. And so that is why the human psyche is so chaotic, because we have all of these competing drives, all these competing egos, and no stable sense of self. And so in order to move from a disordered inner life to an ordered one, and from a false sense of self to a true one, we need to dissolve the eyes that we have inside of us, dissolve the egos that we have inside of us, and liberate the divine essence within each one of those, and then bring together the pieces, the shards of our trapped divinity, and create a more authentic, divinized personality, which is based in truth, which is based in order, which is a worthy vehicle for the divine. And so vices are transformed into virtues. And this teaching was something that you don't really get in the OTO or the AA. You get Liber 30, a text that was inherited from the Golden Dawn, which has a few moral instructions in it. But other than that, there's very little moral instruction at all. And in fact, quite the opposite. It's sort of anything goes in thelemic orders when it comes to moral conduct, which is why so many terrible things happen in orders like the OTO. And I was resistant to this at first, but then, as I spent more time doing Raja Yoga and more time in deep meditation and contemplation, I started to soften a bit to this idea that maybe I need to disconnect from the ego a bit more and find a way of letting go of some things that are egos that I have. And I eventually started doing the work of dissolving the eyes. And it was very rewarding, and receiving that teaching is something that I'm very grateful for. It's been very important. The other thing that I found quite remarkable when studying Gnosis was this idea of Christification that Samael Aun teaches. So Gnosis teaches that the Christ is a cosmic principle, and the same as the Logos, and that any person who has successfully dissolved the plurality of eyes within themselves, liberated that divine essence, awakened in consciousness as well, which is their true divine self, and built up what are called the solar bodies, which is basically like the astral and the mental and the causal bodies and all those sorts of bodies. A person who's successfully done that can then be a worthy vehicle for the Christ to enter into and work through. And a person who has done this is said to have incarnated the Christ within themselves. This is what happened to Jesus, and this is what Samael Aun claims to have done as well. And this was the path that Gnosis was really teaching us. And I found this absolutely fascinating. A path that promised that those who excelled in it could become literal Christs themselves. I would later learn that ancient Gnosticism was alluding to something very similar when I studied the Gospel of Thomas and so forth. But at the time, this was a very new teaching to me and something which just really resonated with me. So really, those were the things that I got the most out of. There are a number of other practices that Gnosis talks about, not all of which I can mention here, but dream yoga was one of them. That was fun. When I spent time in Gnosis, I did have much more vivid dreams and a lot more lucid dreams because I had that intention a lot more when I was going to sleep. And I had a much more rich inner life. I would go places in my dreams. I would teach people. I would be doing transactions with people in terms of their karma, which in Gnosis would be described as working for the law in the inner worlds. I helped people pass on to the next world. And so I had all these little adventures in the astral, and I was doing all of this stuff in the astral because I had learnt the technique of dream yoga, and I'd awoken a lot more to that inner world. Now, I have to say, there were a few teachings within Gnosis that I could never quite stomach because they were very rigid and harsh and extreme, in my opinion. And some of the teachings I found outright fantastical. But I was clearly searching for something important, which Gnosis was teaching to people. And really the things that I've covered were part of that, this idea of the path of Christification, that we should all be aspiring to become Christs ourselves, and this idea of the work on oneself were two fundamentally important ideas. And eventually, as I got more serious within Gnosis, I began exploring the initiatory system of Gnosis, which is described as the three mountains. If you've watched my recent videos, that term will set off something for you. But the three mountains path is very long and very complicated. There's lots of different steps with descriptions such as raising the serpents of fire, the seven serpents of fire and the seven serpents of light, creating the higher bodies, symbolically completing the labors of Hercules and the initiations of the Christ, and liberating the sparks of one's divine essence from the abysses of the planets, and so forth. All of this sounds very esoteric, and some of it actually seems to come from Alice Bailey and Annie Besant's work, but I digress. But really, the meat of this path, the real gist of the path, is the work on oneself. Identifying what are called defects, these eyes that form the plurality of eyes that need to be dissolved, and dissolving them. Doing that through self-analysis, through intellectually understanding them, but then, having a commitment to overcome that defect and using mantras and other techniques to actually direct spiritual energy towards the dissolution of that ego. And using the consciousness to train on the ego for dissolution, not just to try and use a different part of the mind. And so my magical journals from the last few years are primarily full of insights that I had during my own attempts to work this path of the three mountains. Dissolving various eyes, learning spiritual lessons from that as I went along, learning more about my own psychology and different ways that could change, and analysing that and figuring out how the more defective parts of that could change. Although I don't like the word defective. I don't think it's the best word. It carries too much shame, but let's say distorted parts. But this represented a big shift for me, actually, because in my younger days, it was all magic. It was just big, ambitious, ceremonial, magical workings, one after the other, that I was trying to do, these really intense magical rituals. And now suddenly there was a shift, and I became a lot more introspective and reflective, and the work that I was committed to the most was actually this inner psychological work using esoteric tools, not just psychology. And I started practicing magic less and less, except for a few very specific types of magic. And meditation and the work on oneself became much more important in my spiritual life. And actually, in hindsight, learning magic, learning how to invoke or evoke various spirits, learning how to remain in asana for a particular amount of time, all the stuff, the waving a wand around and drawing pentagrams in the air and learning the god names and the names of the archangels and all of that. That was the easy stuff. Even achieving a state of decent meditation was easy compared to confronting the darkness within ourselves and working tirelessly to change that. It's not easy and it takes years. That is the real hard spiritual work. And unfortunately, that's the work that a lot of people, even in esoteric spirituality, fail to even begin. And then they wonder why they lose their minds and spiral into mythomania and delusion and mental illness. Well, that's the reason, because you're amplifying the thing that you should be trying to dissolve and transform, and you're using magic to do that. And so my wife and I both got more and more serious in Gnosis, and we graduated from the introductory course to first chamber to meditation chamber, and then the next stage is something called second chamber. And we needed to go to a new missionary at a new Gnostic center in order to join the second chamber. And it was quite serendipitous the way that this happened. We were meant to be paired up with one missionary couple who were in the US and had to come and travel to Australia. And something happened, and there was like a blizzard, some like huge natural event which actually prevented them from driving to where they needed to go to then be able to go to the airport and then come to Australia. And then there were people getting sick, and it was still in the midst of that thing that happened between 2020 and a few years after that we're learning a lot more about these days. So circumstances seemed to happen which prevented those missionaries from being able to come and teach us. And as a result of that, we were paired up with another missionary couple who were based in our own city. The man that was the leader of this group just happened to be someone who apparently had proceeded so far on the path of the three mountains that he himself would be considered by inference to be somebody who has fully incarnated the Christ. And it would be inappropriate for me to reveal any more details of this individual, but that's something that happened, and it's a significant detail of this part of the path. And so we did end up joining that group, and my wife and I were both very privileged to have him as our teacher for a time and learn directly from him, and that helped me to advance on my own path as well. And there was definitely something different about this guy. He wasn't like other people. You could tell that he had really changed himself in some way, in a good way. So I don't want to speak too more on that, but yeah, it was quite a profound period in my life, being in the orbit of an individual like that. But eventually, my wife and I ceased going to classes. Basically, long story short, we had a child, and that complicated matters. But there was no ill will with anybody when we parted ways with people. It's just something that came to an end almost naturally, you could say. But above all, our experience of Gnosis was quite beneficial, I would say, and we learnt a lot of good things. But our paths in life were leading us in a different direction. Our own beings, our own inner beings, our own monads had a different plan laid out for us for reasons that only the being knows. And it wasn't perfect. As time went on and we encountered more people in the group and more of the missionaries, there were certainly some people who personally I found quite abrasive and very stuffy. But that's just what it's like with other people who all have the ego. But at least they were aware of their ego and they were trying to work on it in theory. There are some people who say that they've been to Gnostic groups and found that it's very cult-like and cite some pretty extreme examples of things. I've never experienced anything that was really appalling. I understand where they're coming from, talking about the cultish seeming aspect of certain things, but honestly, the Democrats of today are probably more cult-like than the Gnostic Association. If Evan Barker's new book, Nothing Left, is anything to go by, I mean, my God. But what I'm trying to say is, while it could feel like certain teachings or certain just individuals within the group were trying to pull things in that direction, I never felt like it was anything too serious or anything that you couldn't just be conscious of and just push back against. But there's always going to be people that you don't get along with as well as other people in any group that you go to. But the thing that is important to me, again, is that the people in Gnosis are doing the work. They are committed to changing themselves, repenting, and transforming the ego into something which is better suited to living in alignment with the divine. And that is something that I don't see very much, not only in the wider world, but in fact within the esoteric world more broadly. And especially considering that I'd come from the background of Thelema as well, and the AA, whatever, it was just me and my superior most of the time, and that was fine. But the OTO was another story altogether. That order is just a complete dumpster fire. There were some truly awful people that I met in the OTO, like about as bad as you can imagine. So based on where I was coming from, Gnosis was a godsend in comparison. And maybe other people have had more negative experiences of particular missionaries or particular centers, and I'm not diminishing that. But I'm just talking about my own experience here. And although I'm not a member of Gnosis anymore, it's had a lasting impact on my spiritual development, and there are still practices from Gnosis that I continue to practice to this day. But much as when I left Thelema, my perspective has shifted since I was a part of that school. And I've been thinking again about my time in Gnosis for a couple of reasons. One is, well, you'll probably remember if you've been watching my recent videos, when I read the 16th call and did a scrying, which I documented on video, that one of the visions that I got was of 3 mountains. And there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that, and I know a couple of you at least have reported back to me that you live right next to 3 mountains, which is quite uncanny. And then another layer of the meaning is perhaps that the angels were encouraging me to think about the time when I was really serious about working the path of the 3 mountains, and thinking about the insights that I can share from that time on my path. And I think I'm ready to do that now. I've hesitated before for really silly reasons, actually, because unfortunately when you talk about the work on oneself, it doesn't get very many views. But even when I put a lot of time and effort into a video these days, the YouTube algorithm is such that I don't get the views that I should get anyway. So I really don't have anything to lose in just talking about whatever I want on this channel now. So perhaps the work on oneself is something that is going to make more of a debut. And it's the really important work, more important than knowing how to do banishing rituals or anything else. This is the really important work if you want to go deep into the path of self-transformation, of inner transformation and spiritual liberation. And another reason I've been thinking more about Gnosis is because I've been interpreting every phenomenon as a particular dealing of God with my soul. I've been very contemplative about my life, reflecting on the various things that I've been through over the years, thinking about the various steps on my magical journey and where it's leading me. The thelema, the Gnosticism, my special interest in Enochian magic, even my childhood Catholicism, is all leading in a certain direction. And I'm on the verge of reaching a new understanding in that regard. And my time in Gnosis was a part of that. And I'll share more about that when I'm ready, but it hasn't fully crystallized yet. But that video is coming as well. And those are the reasons why I wanted to tell you about the Gnostic phase of my journey. And this has been my video on my time in Gnosis. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this video, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit the notification bell so there's more of a chance of you getting notified of my future videos. Leave comments down below to help boost the video in the algorithm. Hit join or thanks is another way you can help me. But what you can really do to help me is join my mailing list, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. And also, I'm speaking at EnochiaCon this year. I'll leave a link to that in the description below as well if you want to sign up to that. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.